Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I am Dean Carmenita Higginbotham. I am, for those of you who I have not met, I'm Dean of VCU Arts. And on behalf of VCU Arts, on behalf of VCU and the ICA, I'm so pleased that you are with us here tonight. As I look out in this darkened podium, but as I saw folks in the lobby, I must say, or it should always be said, that we all as a community, but me as dean, I am deeply grateful for the artists, the colleagues, the visitors, the stakeholders, the friends, the donors, the board members, the members of the administration, including the president and our provosts. I am so grateful for their continued interest, investment, and excitement about the ICA and about this site, the site for contemporary art. Together with all of you, we have created this space, one dedicated to new ideas, to experimentation, to art and discovery. And over the past few months, if you've come through the doors, if you have visited, you would have explored and seen the work of Loie Hollowell and Caitlin Cherry. You will have had a chance to understand the legacy of African American architecture and its history here in Virginia. You would have experienced hosted classes, workshops, lectures, performances, and films, and even partied with a mermaid. And thank you for Chioki and Resonate for that last one. Not often, I read a lot of remarks. It's not often I get to say partied with a mermaid on any given evening. But these various things that I have listed for you, these highlight only the beginning. There is so much more activity and programming that will inspire and transform our visitors. And leading the way will be the new executive director, who I'm very pleased to introduce, Jessica Bell Brown. Now, I will speak of Jessica's bio in just a moment, but let me make some comments about her role and about her new role here at VCU. The ICA is, without a doubt, a unique place, one with both significant opportunities and important responsibilities. Our community looks to the ICA for meaning and connection to the arts. And when the search committee, led by Pam Royal, thank you so much, Pam, and co led by VCU Vice Provost Tim Davey, these two leading this committee set out to select the new executive director. They sought an individual who would fulfill that promise of leading contemporary art in an exemplary and visionary way. And this is no small feat. This committee, led by these two individuals, aspired to find someone who could lead the institution in groundbreaking major commissions and fresh considerations of important emerging artists. And they also searched for someone who would open up new connections in art across time periods and geographies, bringing a keen eye, a sharp intellect, and sustaining empathy. And I would say also a big heart to the role. I am, as dean, I am pleased to announce that they found that and more in Jessica Bell Brown. Jessica joins us from the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she served as associate curator and head of contemporary art from 2019 to 2024. During her tenure there, she organized major blockbuster exhibitions, including A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration. And the show was included in the New York Times list of best exhibitions of 2022. She also developed partnerships, commissions, and led a strong and long slate of acquisitions. Jessica holds a BA from Northwestern and an MA from Princeton University. And I will say, in the few weeks that she has been with us, the energy, the care, the attention, the critical thinking and commitment has already shown through. It has been, even in this short period of time, just a pleasure for me as dean and for everyone in the school to work with her. It truly is. It's been great. So now it is my pleasure, my honor, to welcome Jessica Belbrow.
Thank you so much, Dean. Okay, turtle mother. There we are. Thank you so much, Dean Higginbotham. Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? Yeah, yeah. I'm so thrilled to welcome you back to the ICA. For many of you, this will likely be the first time that you'll be hearing from me as the new executive director. And I couldn't be more thrilled to join such an illustrious community of thinkers, artists, researchers, supporters of all of the creativity that is teeming from the seams here in Richmond and at VCU. So thank you for the warmest of welcomes. I'd also like to thank the entire team at the ICA for their Herculean efforts at facilitating tonight's talk and reception. And I'd especially like to thank Dean Higginbotham and our partners at VCUarts for the kind invitation to take part in this fantastic lecture series. So before I begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we at Virginia Commonwealth University and the VCU Health System and the ICA live and work on traditional lands of the Powhatan Chieftain and the Mnuchin Nation, their ancestors and future generations. We recognize that our university and health system and this institute were built on their homelands, and this acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to contribute to the work of truth and reconciliation, to educate ourselves about Indigenous cultures, and to make visible Virginia's Indigenous histories and untold stories. Tonight's lecture will be based on research towards an ambitious and sprawling group exhibition that I've been working towards, and it's entitled Tentatively Industrious Life. For the past few months, I've been working towards this survey exhibition, which will center international artists working from 1970 to the present, who interrogate materiality and subjectivity through the prisms of history, of global trade, and of labor. I'm deeply grateful to VIA Art Fund Visionary Initiatives in Art, which provided the incredible resource towards research and travel to advance this project last year. Understanding the economic life and material character of a place is inextricable from understanding that the sugar we place in our coffee, the paper onto which we craft a handwritten note, and the cotton sheets onto which we lay our heads at night have all had many routes and origins. It can be argued that artists are keenly aware of the histories and movements of these materials and people across oceans, borders, and boundaries. This project, or the ideas undergirding this project, will constellate the perspectives of artists who employ and elasticize the utility of material and at the same time offer comment to the specific and intertwined historical phenomena that give shape to contemporary experiences of space and place. So before arriving at VCU, many of you know I was a resident of Baltimore, a longtime resident of Baltimore, and I relocated there in 2019 from New York. Once the fastest growing American city at the turn of the 19th century, the Baltimore that I encountered was a town plagued by decades of disinvestment, redlining, and blight. yet it had a vibrant and resilient creative economy that was filled with active artist agents of world building and social and spatial recuperation. So stretching past these last 5 decades, the present is still steeped in Baltimore's and in our region's development across the 18th, even just across the 18th century. The present history looms in the present, and we can think about our regional context here as a part of as a part of a history of global maritime power. We know that factories and textile mills that dotted this region built the sails for ships that were built in Britain and was a site for the trade of human chattel shipped from Louisiana and South Carolina. The cities, our cities, once heralded wealth fueled by the slave trade, was furthered through the rise of industries of sugar refining, grain milling, steel manufacturing, and the construction of the Mid-Atlantic Railroad. And the spirit of this project is about a kind of attunement to the local material histories and simultaneously a way to foreground the perspectives of global artists and artworks who unpack a kind of rhizomatic history of trade, exchange, and labor. So, learning of all of these nuances about where we are cited and contextualized, or even thinking about my childhood shaped in the American South, has been a process of unfolding these converging histories that go far and wide, locally, nationally, and globally. And while a critical early stage of this project was incubated in Baltimore, there are legacies of industrialization, trade, economic downturn that can be traced arguably to many cities, especially right here in Richmond. Notably, the great photographer Baldwin Lee, a documentarian of the American South, at the turning point of the 1980s, which you see here behind me, just through his photography, bridges together the ways in which we can imagine life on the margins of industry, those thinking about subjects who powered this country. So you should know that in my tenure as executive director, one of my priorities, major priorities, will be to build on the ICA as a window onto the world and to reflect the specificity of our regional situatedness within a global conversation through how we exchange and engage with audiences, how we tell stories, and how we further dialogues in and across the contemporary art world. Scholar Lawrence Brown, author of The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, uses cities like Baltimore and by extension, I would argue, Richmond even, as a case study to examine the twinned effects of modern progress and racialized segregation policies, such as redlining, asymmetrical development and pollution, and phenomena that create starkly different outcomes depending on one's race and one's zip code. So I'd like to open with this question about the specificity of place through a consideration of this long array of history. So I'm showing you, I recall a conversation a few months ago about why Richmond. And I am absolutely, as a thinker, obsessed with understanding how we are situated in space and place, how history lives in the present, and how artists are opening our eyes and widening the aperture of those histories. So um, bear with me as I just try to weave together for you some of the impulses that undergird that line of thought. So to open, I want to think about the poetics of Rhea Dillon's work, and specifically her poetics of transit and migration. So you see here an image of her sculpture, swollen whole, broken, birth in the broken, broken birthed, broken deficient whole, at the black woman's altar, at the black woman's tale, a black woman's tale, which marks the artist's ongoing interest in mapping the geographies of the Black British diaspora, from the formation of British colonies vis-a-vis the transatlantic slave trade to the mass migration or return of Black subjects to Great Britain, hailing across the Caribbean and the African diaspora in what was known as the Windrush generation from 48 to 71. Dillon's of to date has culled together the materiality of Black migratory transit from the vantage point of debodied or uncorporeal minimalist and abstract sculpture. Referred to simply as swollen whole, broken birthed here, this work employs four calabashes as a stand in for the womb and connotes cycles of pregnancy, birth, deterioration, death. The calabash, also known as the bottle gourd, is a migratory object in and of itself, originally cultivated in Asia and proliferating across Africa, the Americas, and Europe, and grown for its fruit as well as for its domestic utility as containers, water bearers, and medicine vessels. The artist also utilizes sapele wood, which is a kind of duplication of the effects of mahogany, and it connotes the trade routes of ships created in Europe, filled with goods for trading of West Africans soon to be enslaved, and placed in transit to the Caribbean and to the Americas for disembarkment, commodification, and forced labor, whether it be agrarian, industrial, or even sexual labor. This is a durational and elastic history, one that continues to play out even today as we consider generations of Black British immigrants, especially women, arriving in the economic recovery of World War II in their Sunday bests and optimism in tow to an inhospitable and sometimes hostile context of Great Britain, only to labor invisibly as service workers, caretakers, housekeepers, nannies, and domestic workers, like her grandmother. Entangled within the story of Caribbean immigration, Dillon's work highlights how many have come to the UK under the promise of economic opportunity, and despite such promise, many also found themselves working in labor-intensive industrial jobs in factories, public transport, and healthcare. So I'm interested in the way in which this work takes us back to thinking about histories of the transatlantic slave trade, and at the same time kind of launches us into a future or many futures, and as well as recent past. Thus, the perspective and presence of these gourds offers an autobiographical and historical mapping of Dillon's poetics of transit. This migratory global calabash echoes the triangular trade paths and routes and is grown and sourced from Maroontown, Jamaica, a site of resilience and refusal for self-liberated Africans who escaped plantations to hide and defend their autonomy and freedom in the forested highlands and mountains as early as the 1730s. Broken, like many circuits of spatial awareness in Dillon's work, is created from the vantage point of the height of the average Black woman as well, which is around 5'4" or 160 centimeters. In a recent interview with fellow British Turner Prize winning sculptor Anthea Hamilton, Dillon remarked, "I always think about a birthing, how one rebirths, how we give birth, the support of labor, the labor and support. I think about what the academic Catherine McKittrick expressed through Imnor B. Phillips' poetry of how a geographic story could be produced from the last space that they thought of, from the place in between, the leg, the seemingly silence, the expendable Black feminine body, part sand, ourselves. So, end quote. What does it mean to position one's selfhood and subject to formation across national contexts, across global historical narratives? And what does this schema of thinking about Black female subjectivity estranged from, but not inextricably linked to embodied histories? At Tate Britain, where this work was installed, it was one of those kinds of works that you don't really see until you have reached the sort of terminus of the exhibition. Meaning that was installed above this elegant uh, sort of crown molding of the grand entrance into one of their galleries, tying together the architectural situatedness of the Tate Britain itself as a symbol of wealth accumulation, capitalist gain, and the stretch of the Commonwealth. Dylan thus creates a bridge between the industrial landscape and the personal and cultural histories embedded within them. Her aesthetics offer an abstraction of this slave trade as foundational to Black movement, but also as a stage for epochs of migration that stretch across centuries and forges these economic and social consequences in everyday life. Another work of Dylan's that will make an appearance in this project, I want to talk about a Caribbean ossuary, and I'm quoting Dylan here. Objects are imbued with the experience of how we live and work with them. I think a lot about the relationships that we build to objects, to materials. How has this wood or this mahogany affected me or brought me to understand it? How do they also tell a story of my family members? Mahogany is indigenous to West Africa, and it was also found in the materials that were predominantly used to build the slave ships in the first leg of the triadic trade. So it would have been an object that was experienced and used by my ancestors. It's then a formal inherited material that I'm working with. Objects also hold a domesticity. Can I have found a tree? Perhaps not, but maybe the tree had to find me. It's greater than me, stronger than me, older than me. So how do I interact with those objects, and how have I given a soul to these objects? So holding that into suspension, a Caribbean ossuary draws on the mass production of cut glass, which was popularized in Germany, Britain, and France between the 18th and 19th centuries. This decorative form was made more widely available through mass production. And in the creation of this work, a Caribbean ossuary, Dylan acquired in Marseille, in the connection of this sort of the memory of the significance of this decorative art form. She acquired these dozens of pieces of cut glass in Marseille and held them within the sort of golden handcuffs of a mahogany cabinet, and arranged them as such to be gazed upon but not used. And she shipped dozens of pieces of this cut glasswork, unsecured, unpackaged, so that the forms would break into fragments and transit from France to London, displayed not upright, but flat on the ground. The ossuary is a catacomb for these once divine objects. Dylan goes on to describe the metaphor of the ossuary for this sculpture. He says, "The cabinet is the same frame and build as the one that's in my grandma's house. It contains cut crystal glasses and bowls and is placed on its back on the ground in reference to a kind of mooring. It holds itself in a similar way to a boat. That piece was created in conversation with my grandma, who was born in Jamaica and is part of the Windrush generation. A cabinet is a symbol and also an anchor in a typical Caribbean household of someone in her generation. The cut crystal pieces were only for when the queen came to tea. I took my grandma to see the exhibit where this work was shown on the last day, and we discussed that it's also a display of class, a lower class opulence. Dylan recuperates a kind of elegance in minimal forms that extrapolate these complexities of colonialism, migration, and lived experience through materials that themselves were made manifest, first forged by hand and through mass production. And I'm interested in that productive tension between the hand and what's mass produced. Switching gears, I want to show in contrast the work of German-born photographers Bernd and Ila Becher, who present an alternative vision of not the product of labor, but the location of resource extraction, refinement, and distribution through labor. The Bechers were captivated by topographies of these kinds of buildings, blast furnaces, grain mills, factories, refineries. And they were interested in the characteristics of these buildings as a kind of modernist accomplishment. They developed a term or adopted a term around the sort of idea of a typology, so that one could take a kind of scientific approach to understanding this industrial architecture. They were known to prioritize photographing on overcast days so that they could control the light and how it impacted how the building was enframed through the photograph. And their language was very formal. Quote, "We photograph water towers and furnaces because they are honest, they are functional, and they reflect what they do," they once remarked. The Behers traveled throughout the coal towns and mines of Germany, France, and Belgium, all over industrialized Europe, but also spent time stateside, specifically in Baltimore, where they photographed the structures of Bethlehem Steel or Betham Steel, and in Youngstown, Ohio. So you're seeing here an image of the Edgar Thomson Steelworks plant in Youngstown, or excuse me, in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Um, Originary to the indigenous tribes, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Monongahela, the Iroquois, until the turn of the 19th century, this region, um, where the Monongahela River stretches across Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, saw a rapid transformation from a site for fur trading and mercantile exchange to sweeping industrialization. And the town's economy began, or industrial economy began around 1873 when Andrew Carnegie built the steel plant that you're seeing here on the historic site of Braddock's Field, and which is now known as North Braddock, Pennsylvania. This is one of the first American steels that used the Bessemer process, and it was operative as a massive mill until 1875, and then incorporated with U.S. Steel in 1901. And at its peak, had about 340,000 steelworkers under its employ. But Thompson Steel, or the Edgar Thomson Steel plant, really contributed to significant environmental pollution throughout its history. From its founding in 1875, the plant's operations produced air, water, and soil pollution amidst an era of lax environmental regulation. And output from the plant was prioritized over the threats of sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, pollutants, emissions, discharged heavy metals, cadmium and arsenic runoff, and hazardous waste, all dumped into the water supply. The plant was one of many that lined the banks of the river across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. And you won't be surprised to recall that people are never pictured within the Behr's frames. And their straightforward yet meticulously crafted views celebrated the feat of modernist industrial architecture and the thousands of Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Slavics, African Americans that all powered these mills, once ones who often took on the hardest and lowest paying and most dangerous jobs were relegated to a cloak of invisibility. Artist Latoya Ruby Frazier recalls the history of this plant in relation to her hometown of Braddock in 2012. To create this image that you see of the contextual details around the Thompson plant, Frazier rented a helicopter to create aerial views of Braddock. She offers a bleak contrast to the glorification of industrial architecture of the Behers. Frazier gives us a proviso in her social documentary photography. In the series Notion of Family from circa 2004 to 2014, the artist traced the human cost of Rust Belt industrialization in the 21st century. In this work, we see the destruction and devastation brought about by the activities of the steel mill. Steel production was once the economic steel production once the economic decline of the 1970s arrived, and the lifeline kind of dried up. Thousands of folks and their families were without jobs and access to health care, and plagued by chronic disease brought by environmental disaster and poverty. Her lens, Frazier's lens, is met with the lens of the highly personal still life as familial portrait, an image of her loved one's nightstand, their family pictures, cigarettes, keys, all become a kind of memento mori of that high cost. Much of Fraser's work, as many of you might know, um, attempts to parse the pixel and the picture, the structural and the personal. I'm also interested in the materiality that artists like Adebunmi Gabadedo works with. She takes us to the True Blue plantation in South Carolina, where her ancestors were once enslaved. True Blue was once the epicenter of both Carolina gold rice production and indigo production in the American South. We know that indigo was grown in early South Carolina to produce this blue dye that was exported from England for use in the British textile industry. Um, Indigo was a significant part of the South Carolina economy from the 1740s to the 1790s. We also know that during this period, indigo was South Carolina's second most valuable export behind rice. So thousands of hands in the South Carolina Low Country went into the production of these goods. And Anna Eliza Clay William, an ancestor of the artist, is called upon in the work that you see here, referencing directly through its making the soil that was used in the firing of this vessel, taken directly from the land. Lining the lip and the mouth of the piece are meticulously placed grains of rice that emerge like teeth. Crops grew from this red earth that my ancestors are currently buried. That earth carries their blood, their flesh, their bones. The artist remarked in a recent interview on her connection to True Blue Plantation and its tie to her materials of choice. Emory University's archives tells us that True Blue Plantation was established around 1711 upon 500 acres that belonged to Anthony Shorey, who bequeathed the property to his son, Anthony Shorey Jr. And in 1824, the junior, the latter, more than doubled his acreage. The land was tilled and cultivated by 65 documented African slaves, and that property has now been developed as a luxury resort and golf treat in the growing tourist industry in the Low Country today. Just some more views of the work, which is absolutely elegant and stunning and piercing. The sea is cipher. I want to talk a little bit about Dominic White's work. White uses kaolin and forged iron, materials that make frequent appearances in the sprawling sculptural installations and environments that she creates. The artist works between Marseille and coastal England. Can We Be Known Without Being Hunted gives us a view into how White conceptualizes new artifacts of the sea to parse the idea of hierarchy, the ability of individuals to gain power over land by ruling through the instruments of water. These uncorporeal bodies are hung from invisible lines, suspended and unfurling as kaolin-dusted forms pool on the ground. We as viewers are gazing upon a seemingly precarious entanglement. The basis of play, strands of raffia behave like textile, forged iron and mahogany morph into enlarged hooks. We are confronted with a kind of catastrophe, an aftermath. In the work Dead Reckoning and in The Swelling Enemy, we see these drawings of forged iron in space, and ciphers for the massive ships that transported goods and people. The hauntings of the past are laid bare for us, unresolved. Ledgers of ships, we know through research, reveal the exchange of goods, raw materials, and people in port cities that dot the US, East Coast, and Gulf, the Caribbean, West Africa, as well as Europe. And White asks us to dwell in the space of unimaginable conjuring. These are the new artifacts. White explains, but if blackness is eternally bound in the ship with no means of escape, the only logical route out is to become more demonic, to become more rebellious or unquantifiable, to emerge in places that are impossible for Blackness to be ungovernable, to be the antithesis of the categorization of Blackness itself. And so I'm quite interested in the ways in which White is calling upon the kind of haunting of this history and at the same time using materials that supersede their utility. Um, supersede their utility, but also kind of power sort of global economic life, like kaolin, which is massively sort of produced in China. It's the basis for porcelain and clay. It's also kaolin mines dot the American South. So I'm really interested in the kind of dissonance of this work as well. Alan Sekula's fish story takes into consideration the era of globalization in the 1980s and 90s. So continuing with this sort of maritime theme, I'm interested in considering Sekula in bringing to light what scholar Timothy Morton would have called in 2013 as a hyperobject. Globalization as this phenomena that Sekula, I think, brings into greater visibility and to comprehension for a wider public through his documentary photography. International waterways, massive ocean liners, dock workers, sailors, migrants, store clerks, storefronts, ports, scrapyards, and beyond all come into a near cinematic narrative. Completed between 89 and 95, this project was a magnum opus and offered a seismic shift in the ambition of the documentary photographic form, envisioning it as a medium that could capture both the pixel and the picture of the social space of the sea and its evolution in our society, in all of its slowness and in its rapid speed. Sekula created this work not from a vast critical distance, but up close and personal. And over the years, he's even collected objects and ephemera from dock workers and seafarers, Portuguese coffee cups and bags of beans, all of these kinds of objects accumulated over time are artifacts held in the form of a kind of conceptual museum for dock workers that doesn't necessarily accompany a fish story, but came as a sort of product of the activity, the photographic activity itself. I'd like to conclude this conversation with a consideration of Gordon Matta Clark's Day's End. Trained as an architect, Matta Clark rejected all conventional notions of what buildings were designed for and how they could be used. And instead, he embraced the idea of anarchitecture, which he coined to describe how he would manipulate architectural forms. In 1975, he used a chainsaw to cut into two windows on the western wall of the Marine Transfer Station that faced the Hudson, flooding the cavernous space with light from the sunset on the water. This was the shed at Pier 52, which was used as a warehouse for trash by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. This structure was torn down in 1979. So much of our understanding of Matta Clark's Day's End is mediated through the photographic medium. The monumentalization of the pier itself, through the excision of from its edifice, can only be taken in as a whole through the photograph or through the kind of psychosocial experience of piecing together an estimation of what that excision may have felt like, or how one's embodied experience can have this encounter with an industrial ruin. Thus, the artist calls attention to a kind of desolation of the site, and through its documentation, the building itself, the pier as a subject, and the human experience of this transformation of the city is relegated to the margins. So as I conclude, and really this is a kind of open question for me, is how we might consider a series of visual juxtapositions and provocations that allow us to take Matta Clark's intervention and think about it not as an architectural impulse, an architectural impulse, to be clear. But as a way to re-engage with the vestiges or hauntings of many pasts, and how if we listen and observe, those vestiges remain with us even in the present. So I welcome you all on this journey of research and exploration. I don't know that we have time for questions in here because the reception is going to start in a few minutes, in a couple of minutes, literally. But thank you so much for your engagement and your attention. I so look forward to working with you all and sharing the ICA with you in the weeks and months and years to come. Thank you.